On the night of June 27, 2025, Neha and Aria were staying at a short-term rental property in El Portal, Florida. It was meant to be a temporary mother-daughter getaway during a trip from Oklahoma. According to Neha's initial statement, the evening had been ordinary. They had spent the day together, gone out, returned to the Airbnb, and eventually gone to sleep. But sometime around the early morning hours, everything changed. Neha told investigators she woke up and noticed something was wrong. Her daughter was no longer in bed. The sliding glass door leading to the backyard was open. And when she stepped outside, she saw Aria in the swimming pool. What followed was a frantic attempt to rescue her child. Neha remained on the line with emergency dispatchers, explaining that she could not swim and could not reach her daughter. Dispatchers urged her to find any object nearby, anything that could help pull the child out. But the situation escalated too quickly. Emergency responders were dispatched immediately to the scene. When they arrived, they pulled Aria from the water and began life-saving CPR. She was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital. But it was already too late. At approximately 4:28 in the morning, Aria Gupta was pronounced dead. In the early hours of the investigation, authorities treated the case as a tragic drowning. A child had been found in a pool. A mother had called for help. And there was no immediate sign of foul play. But that assumption would not last long. Now if you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here," so I can see who is truly following this case with us. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Cold Case 247 for more real-life investigations told with respect and clarity. Because what investigators discovered next would completely shift the direction of this case. When detectives reviewed the scene more closely, they began noticing inconsistencies. The first concern came from the autopsy. According to publicly reported findings, Aria's body did not show the typical internal signs of drowning. In many drowning cases, water is found in the lungs and stomach. But in this case, something did not align. Instead, medical examiners noted injuries inside the child's mouth, including cuts and bruising. Based on these findings, the conclusion shifted away from accidental drowning. The cause of death was reclassified as asphyxiation. Specifically, smothering. That single conclusion changed everything. Because smothering does not happen by accident in a swimming pool scenario. It suggests external force. It suggests intent. And it suggests that the original explanation given to investigators may not reflect what truly happened inside that house. Within days, the case escalated dramatically. Authorities announced that Neha Gupta was now being charged in connection with her daughter's death. A mother who had called for help at 3 in the morning was now considered a suspect in a homicide investigation. By the time investigators moved to arrest her, Neha had already left Florida and returned to Oklahoma. That triggered coordination between Florida authorities, Oklahoma law enforcement, and U.S. Marshals. A nationwide search began. When officers finally located her residence, they moved in with a warrant. Neha was taken into custody without immediate physical resistance and later extradited back to Florida to face charges. She entered a plea of not guilty. From that moment forward, the case stopped being about a drowning and became a legal battle over intent, evidence, and conflicting interpretations of what happened inside that Airbnb. Investigators then turned to motive. And what they found added even more complexity. Court records revealed a custody dispute between Neha and Aria's father, involving ongoing disagreements over parenting decisions, schedules, and medical concerns. There were also claims from court-appointed professionals that tensions between the parents had been escalating. Reports described disputes, communication breakdowns, and concerns raised during the custody process. At one point, a request was made for psychological evaluation as part of the ongoing family court proceedings. None of this proved a crime. But in a homicide investigation, context matters. Detectives began asking whether emotional pressure, custody conflict, or personal stress could have played a role in what happened that night. At the same time, the defense maintained a completely different position. They argued that Aria's death was a tragic accident. They stated that the child may have exited the room unnoticed, accessed the pool area, and drowned unintentionally. According to the defense, there was no proof of intentional harm. Just a devastating loss that unfolded too quickly for anyone to prevent. And that is where this case currently stands. Between two competing narratives. One side pointing to medical findings suggesting asphyxiation. The other insisting on accidental drowning. And a court system now tasked with determining what truly happened in those final moments. Because at the center of all the evidence, all the arguments, and all the headlines, is a 4-year-old child whose life ended far too soon. And a case that continues to raise one of the most difficult questions in true crime. How does a moment of tragedy become a criminal investigation? If you made it this far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case 247, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this was a tragic accident? Or something more intentional? Because in cases like this, the truth is never simple, and sometimes, it takes years before it fully comes to light. The investigation did not stop at the autopsy report. In fact, for detectives, that report was only the beginning of a much deeper examination into what truly happened inside that Florida Airbnb during those early morning hours. Because while the surface story appeared simple, a child found in a pool, the medical findings suggested something far more complicated. And in cases like this, every small inconsistency matters. Not because it immediately proves guilt, but because it forces investigators to ask harder questions. Questions that can change the entire direction of a case. Following the initial medical review, authorities began reconstructing the timeline more carefully. They looked at the moment emergency services were called. They reviewed the layout of the Airbnb property. And they examined the physical access points between the bedroom and the backyard pool area. What they found was a sequence of events that could support more than one interpretation. On one hand, a child waking up in the middle of the night and wandering outside was not impossible. On the other hand, investigators had to consider how a 4-year-old would have managed to open doors, navigate in the dark, and reach a swimming pool without alerting anyone. These were not conclusions. They were questions. But in criminal investigations, questions often carry as much weight as answers. As the inquiry continued, detectives also focused on digital and physical evidence from the Airbnb itself. Security footage from the property became a key piece of interest. According to publicly available reports, the footage did not capture the actual moment Aria entered the pool. However, it did support portions of Neha Gupta's timeline regarding movement inside the residence before the emergency call. This created a complicated evidentiary picture. Nothing clearly showed an act of violence. But nothing definitively confirmed a simple accident either. The case was beginning to exist in a space investigators often find most challenging: uncertainty. Meanwhile, outside the investigative process, the case began to attract public attention. As news of the child's death and the circumstances surrounding it spread, discussions emerged across media platforms. Some viewers focused on the emotional weight of the 911 call. A mother pleading for help. A child in danger. A moment of panic that anyone could imagine themselves in. Others, however, focused on the autopsy findings. The absence of water in the lungs. The presence of internal injuries. The conclusion that the cause of death may not have been drowning at all. Two narratives began forming at the same time. And both were emotionally powerful in completely different ways. As the case developed, authorities also began examining Neha Gupta's background more closely. She was a medical professional. A pediatrician. Someone trained to recognize signs of distress, injury, and medical emergency. To investigators, this fact was not automatically incriminating. But it did become relevant in understanding how she reacted during the emergency, particularly during the critical minutes between discovering her daughter and calling 911. Those minutes became one of the most heavily discussed aspects of the case. Because in emergency situations involving children, time is often the most important factor. And according to the timeline presented in early reports, there was a gap between discovery and the emergency call that investigators sought to understand in greater detail. Whether that gap was the result of panic, confusion, physical limitation, or something else entirely remained an open question. As scrutiny increased, additional background details from the family court proceedings also resurfaced publicly. The relationship between Neha Gupta and Aria's father had been legally complex, involving custody arrangements and ongoing disagreements. Court filings referenced concerns raised during that process, including requests for evaluation and observations from professionals involved in the case. These details did not establish criminal behavior, but they added context that investigators could not ignore. Because in many child death investigations involving family members, the emotional and psychological history between parents can sometimes provide insight into motive, or at least into the broader environment surrounding the child. Still, detectives remained cautious. Custody disputes are common. Tragedies are also, unfortunately, common. The challenge was determining whether those two realities had intersected in this specific case. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement reached a critical turning point. Based on the autopsy interpretation and the totality of early findings, authorities moved from treating the case as a possible accident to treating it as a potential homicide. That shift changed everything. Because once a case becomes a homicide investigation, every detail is re-evaluated under a different lens. Statements are re-examined. Timelines are reconstructed again and again. And every inconsistency, no matter how small, becomes significant. Soon after, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Neha Gupta. But when authorities attempted to locate her in Florida, they learned she had already returned to Oklahoma. At that point, jurisdictional coordination became necessary. Florida investigators worked with Oklahoma law enforcement and federal marshals to locate and detain her. For investigators, timing was critical. Not only because of flight risk concerns, but because high-profile cases often evolve quickly in public perception once charges are announced. When officers eventually arrived at her residence in Oklahoma City, the operation was carried out under a warrant. Neha Gupta was taken into custody without immediate resistance. She was later extradited back to Florida to face formal charges. At her arraignment, she entered a plea of not guilty. Her legal team maintained from the beginning that Aria's death was a tragic accident. They argued that there was no reliable evidence proving intentional harm. And they emphasized that assumptions should not replace proof. As the legal process began unfolding, the case quickly became the subject of national attention. News outlets highlighted the emotional complexity of the situation. A pediatrician, a mother, a child, and a death that appeared, depending on interpretation, either deeply tragic or deeply suspicious. Public opinion began to split. Some focused on the emotional weight of the emergency call. Others focused on the medical findings and inconsistencies in the explanation of events. And between those two perspectives, the truth remained under legal examination. At this stage, prosecutors adjusted charges as the case developed, reflecting the evolving interpretation of evidence. Meanwhile, defense attorneys continued to argue that the facts supported accidental death, not intentional harm. Both sides prepared for a long legal battle. Because cases like this are rarely resolved quickly. They depend on expert testimony, forensic interpretation, and the ability of a jury to evaluate complex medical and circumstantial evidence. And as of the latest publicly available updates, Neha Gupta remains in custody awaiting further legal proceedings. The case has not yet reached a final verdict. Which means the most important question remains unanswered. What truly happened inside that Airbnb during those early morning hours? Was it a tragic accident that unfolded in seconds? Or a moment that investigators have interpreted differently based on medical evidence? Until the court reaches a conclusion, both possibilities remain part of the record. If you've made it this far, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case 247, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this was an accident that was misinterpreted? Or a case where the evidence tells a darker story? Because in cases like this, the truth is not just about what happened. It's about what can ultimately be proven.